You've been at DWP for about 7 months now.
Yeah.
What's made you angry?
Oh, God. Well, recently it's reading that report about people who've been told by the government basically that they are not able to work, but reading those comments from people who would just want a chance and for far too long have not been given a helping hand.
And what overall, and the whole time that you've been minister, has been most infuriating about the job or about the situation?
What's always made me angry in politics, it's the overlooking of the skills and talents of ordinary people in this country. You know, I think when the Department for Work and Pensions turned into, you know, the benefits processing department again, it's just seeing people as a cost and not their potential. And Liz and I and the whole team at DWP are determined that we are not the Department for Welfare, we're the Department for Work, because that is about saying we are the department for having ambition for, I would say, working class people in this country.
You've called this the greatest employment challenge for a generation. Why is it a crisis when we have higher labour force participation rate than the OECD and EU averages? We have more working age people in work than the United States. And unemployment is lower than it was for the whole of the 40-year period between 1975 and 2015. So why is it now a crisis?
Unemployment has changed, I would argue. So the difference between what we call technical unemployment and what we call economic inactivity is active looking. So this is just a thing of definitions, really, that we use the word unemployment when somebody wants a job right now and they're actively looking. If somebody is out of work and would like a job, but there's barriers in their way, we don't technically call that unemployment. But my view is that's just as bad. And in some ways, and especially at the moment, I would say it's worse because if, you know, I'm old enough to remember when the unemployment figures led the news every night. And for a long time, that has not happened over our levels of economic inactivity. And so to me, that's like not just being out of work, but also out of sight of the government. Obviously, I would say the Tory government that should have been doing something about this the whole time. And now hopefully the problem is in the sight of the new Labour government and we're trying to bring about changes to make sure that people, whether they're technically inactive or technically unemployed, get help into work. And I would just say on the stats, look at the trend for the employment rate. So our employment rate was steadily growing for some years, and then it falls off a cliff at the time of the pandemic and hasn't really recovered. So whilst you're right, technical unemployment is at a level that would be considered low, historically speaking, in this country or compared to perhaps other countries around the world, really it's the employment rate that we think about most. And there are big structural forces, you know, that have helped the employment rate to rise, not least women joining the labour force over the decades. But something happened in the United Kingdom during and just post the pandemic, and there are lots of different things that add up to that effect. But I think it's really important that we turn it around and we get that employment rate steadily growing once again.
And what is it that happened in the UK that makes it different from other countries in terms of who is out of work and how long they're out of work?
Compared to other countries, we didn't bounce back in the same way in employment terms. People will say, oh, well, you know, it's not waiting lists or whatever because there isn't a one-for-one relationship in somebody coming off a waiting list, getting health treatment and moving in to work. And whilst that's broadly true, it's not quite true because there is a higher proportion of people on waiting lists who are having issues at work. But what I would say is overall, if you look at the health of the nation, Britain has not done well coming out of the pandemic. And particularly, like, older people are obviously, like, we should expect them to be more likely to be out of work, unwell. But the group that worries me the most is young people, where we have got nearly 1 million young people out of work, and many of them not well, and not just out of work, but not in educational training either. So where the problems are, I believe, is within those groups where we would expect people to have moved into work post-school, in some cases post-university, and that doesn't seem to be happening in the same way. There's a fair bit of analysis of this. The problems are complex. Yes, there's a lot of mental health issues, but also geography has an impact. And economists like Louise Murphy at the Resolution Foundation have shown how, if you live disconnected from urban centres of employment, you are also more likely to be out of work. And to me, that's a worry, because whilst anybody being out of work, if they want to be earning, is bad, we know the consequences that echo down the years of a young person who misses out on that first job, and it takes them longer to get back in, and they're less likely to achieve the kind of pay levels that they would have had they got that first job when they wanted it.
And then we see a kind of compounding effect in people's health, don't we, in the data? We see people listing multiple conditions and work capability assessments. We see, like you said, people being out of work for longer. And you mentioned that the Resolution Foundation now, I think they've shown people in their 20s are now more likely to be out of work long-term due to ill health than people in their 40s. Yeah. And these should be the healthiest people in the labour market, right?
They should be the healthiest people in the labour market. They're also missing out on a really important moment in their career, which is that first job, that first boss. So statistically, we know that it can be very damaging, but psychologically, I would also argue people are really missing out. And I'd just make the point again, there's also a geographical challenge here. There's this major drop-off in employment at the time of the pandemic, and we failed to recover. But look at where that impact is worse. And it's in those places that had a poor quality labour market to begin with. So, we have an ambition to get the United Kingdom, as I said, back to trend, heading towards 80% employment rate, which is what the best countries in the world manage to get up to. Some parts of our country are already at 80%. Some areas already have 80% employment. Others are way down below in the 60s. And that's where, the economic clustering effect means that poor job opportunities discourage workers who are there. They end up with worse health and economic outcomes, which then makes it a harder deal to get that investment that creates a new job. So we're really trying to change in DWP with the new government. We're trying to really look at those underlying causes that drive this clustering effect and try to turn it around so that you get good jobs coming into an area at the same time as changing job centres so that they're really able to get people into better work.
I mean, that's reflected in what some people have said to me who I've spoken to for the New Statesman, that Britain doesn't really make sense to talk about the British labour market.
That's right. It's
because
not
it has
one thing.
Multiple labour markets. There's no, a labour market in a rural area at one end of the country will be completely different to an urban area at the other end of the country.
That's right.
How do you make policy for that covers the whole country, but also, addresses those disparities?
The first thing is the Department for Work and Pension runs a social security system that, is a bulwark against the impact of poverty. So that is a big national system that, provides or should provide, if it works well, a floor for everybody. And then on top of that, you have to design a system that is able to respond to those local conditions, where we have devolved institutions that are capable and that want to play a bigger role in supporting people into employment. We tried to design policy change to help that. So in our white paper in November that we published, we described areas where we're able to devolve employment support, let it be designed and managed by those with skin in the game. It should match up to the kind of investment strategies that our city region mayors have. So if you're saying, right, we want to invest in our energy production as a city region, we also want to design the system to help people get those good jobs. So we've tried to match up employment support as part of the growth plans that local areas have. But equally, I know that there's lots of places in this country where, particularly in England, where there isn't yet that devolution. So we need to be able to have flexibility locally. And the one thing I would say is that having come into the Department for Work and Pensions, it's a really big department that's got people everywhere. And what I found is that in those places where economic fortunes are often worse, my colleagues in the DWP are already working really hard with partners on the ground. They just need the time and the freedom to get it right.
Okay, so we've got a country where there's a worrying trend for people to be out of work longer due to ill health, particularly young people, and particularly because of mental health, right? So if you look at the most recent ONS figures, about 1.35 million people economically inactive, due to depression, bad nerves or anxiety. About 85% of work capability assessments mention a health condition, mention a mental health condition. This is obviously to do with the pandemic, but there's also in certain quarters a certain suspicion of mental health being used as perhaps an excuse, or Rishi Sunak, while the Conservatives were still in government, talked about the kind of the medicalisation of everyday problems. To what extent do you think there is a group of people who are using mental health as the primary reason who might actually in fact be able to work?
Well, the first thing I think in response to that is you don't get very far by having a go at people and blaming them in this world. I think of this problem in two ways. Firstly, we know far more about really serious mental health conditions now than we ever have before. And so if you've got somebody who's dealing with like a serious mental health condition for which, you might have long-term treatment, over many years, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, my NHS colleagues say that work is a really important part of treatment. So we're working hard to get employment advice into care pathways. Yes, of course, so that person can be in work and so on, but really because it's better for their health. And because if you're trying to help somebody recover, the routine and the social connection and the dignity and self-worth of work is a crucial part of recovery. But that's really, that's with a health objective in mind. So I don't think we should ever be in a position ever again, as perhaps it was in the past, where people are ashamed to talk about things like schizophrenia or those really serious mental health, complex eating disorders, that kind of thing, where work is an important part of it, and we need to kind of end the assumption that there's certain conditions where that person just cannot work, and we need to try and figure out a way to help people. So thinking about less significant mental health conditions, mild to moderate conditions, the way I look at it is we all have mental health, good, bad, indifferent, and work, because we spend so much time there, and also because it's often, where we focus a lot of our attention, can be quite a determining factor in whether we have good mental health or not. So what I would like it to be everybody's business. My friend and colleague Luciana Berger, who worked on mental health policy for Keir Starmer, once said to me, we just need to make sure good mental health is everybody's business. And I think she's right about that. I think in workplaces up and down the country, and this is less DWP specific, but more a kind of broader employment policy, I think in workplaces up and down the country, we can all do things that make it more likely that we'll on balance have better mental health, like making sure that we've got access to fresh air in the middle of the day, particularly if we're having a stressful day, making sure that we have good management. The CIPD have done a lot of research on the productivity improvements that could be gained by having better management. And I think there are mental health gains there as well. And for me, that's not about the specifics of diagnosis or not. that's dependent on each person, but rather to think of work as something that we all need in our daily lives to have that sense of dignity and self-respect. And done well, it can be really positive for our mental health.
And what do businesses say to you about that, though? Because, I mean, you've got a fair bit of backlash from, the measures that this government is taking on workers' rights and employees' rights. If you go to businesses and say, right, I want you to spend a lot more on management training because, sort of 80-something% of new managers are basically untrained. We want you to, make sure your staff are treated better. They're going to say that's going to cost a load of money, and that's, we're not going to deliver the economic growth you want, aren't they?
Well, the first thing I would say is having been in frontline politics for 14 years, I think certainly a lot of businesses are way ahead of us in politics in understanding this. How do you manage for productivity? How do you get the best out of people? And I've spoken to a lot of businesses who, understand this very well. And as I said, it's CIPD who've been really the champions of this. And, they represent all kinds of managers and, personnel professionals and so on. The second thing I would say is that, unfortunately, the Department for Work and Pensions has not necessarily had the kind of relationship with employers that we would have wanted. Only 1 in 6 employers really thinking about using job centres to recruit. So we're trying to change that. So when I talk to employers about what they're looking for in their people, I do think they care very deeply about managing people well. I think there's probably a difference perhaps between very large employers and smaller employers in the kind of resources that they're able to put into it just quite naturally. But I think employers really care about treating their people well.
Not all of them, though, right? I mean, you have a lot of employers who are still using, limited hours for people, who are, getting rid of people on 0 hours contracts, who are
not
treating
all of
people
them,
badly.
But that's what the new legislation is for, so that the better employers are not undercut by people who want to treat people badly. Yeah. And certainly, as I say, those that I speak to about our relationship between the job centre and those employers, that they know that the best way to get good work out of people is, as I've said, is to make sure that employees' mental health is everybody's business, and that we do basic things that, often not that complicated. As I said, making sure that people have got the ability to go out and have a bit of fresh air when things are stressful, making sure that, there's access to kind of water and all of those things that certainly when I was growing up were not always the case. Making sure that people have got those needs taken care of, I think that's where employers are.
So it matters how you treat people. It matters how you talk about people, right? So when you have, you'll recognise this quote, I'm sure you'll have heard it repeatedly over the past week, when you have the Work and Pension Secretary saying a certain proportion of people on health-related benefits are taking the mickey, what are we to understand by that? What proportion of people on health-related benefits are taking the mickey? So
what Liz was saying was like that, we're not idiots, and that we don't think that absolutely every single person has got, is a perfect human being with perfect motivation. That's all she was saying. Actually, we did some research in the DWP and spoke to people who are on health-related benefits. And we think there's about 200,000 of those people out there who would like a job now. And a third of all people, and bearing in mind this is mainly people who've been told by the government that they can't work, a third of people who, if they had the right support, be that health support or employment support, would like to move into work. So when you look at that research, I read it and thought, God, we've got to help people. And I know, hand on heart, when people go into a job centre now, our work coaches are brilliant, but they haven't got enough time with people.
One of the people that I spoke to this feature said, if your government is telling you that you're permanently incapable of work, then you're not going to go out looking for a job.
It is. The work capability assessment doesn't work for anybody. And I think it's got worse. Universal credit was introduced by Ian Duncan Smith, he claimed that it was going to help smooth people's path into work. And looking at the statistics, I'm not sure that's been a success. There's two parts of it. There's the social security system itself, universal credit, and then there's the environment that people are in. So I have no doubt that where people don't have chances and opportunities of the kind that I would want them to, that makes it worse. But even within the social security system, what you see is basically people being in two groups and the barriers between those groups becoming higher and harder over the past few years. There used to be a middle group of people who were like on their way to work. That was taken away in 2017. And, if you just look at the data, you can see that once people are put in that group, limited capacity for work-related activity, they don't leave. And I don't think our evidence shows that that's what people really want. But I think people are worried and scared, and I don't blame anybody for that after the past 14 years of Tory rule. And I think the Department for Work and Pensions hasn't offered people the kind of help that we really, really want to help people with. I was in Bolton today meeting some of my colleagues who've been trialling a job centre on wheels. And the reason why we've gone for a job centre in a van is because we want to try and break down some of the barriers and get out to where people are and, really make connections and see if actually you can encourage people to come and get advice in a way that makes it easier for them just because you're there and on hand. And the anecdotal feedback they gave me in Bolton was that it had been really popular. They'd been over to Bolton Wanderers Football Club, to Bolton Wanderers Cost of Living Day, just connecting people where they are. And it's through that kind of experimentation and doing things differently, I think we will break down some of those barriers that were set up by the last government. Yeah.
And I think, one of the things about that kind of measure, I guess, is that you're able to reassure people using that kind of face-to-face contact that if they go into work, they won't be worse off, right? Because that's, from what I've been told, one of the problems is that people fear the loss of their benefits if they start going into work because they might have an unrealistic picture of how the system actually works.
Work feels like a risk. We've got to make sure that it doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like an opportunity. And there can be a lot of problems. Like, for example, if you've got caring responsibilities and you're not sure if you go into work whether you'll be able to fulfill those caring responsibilities properly, then work can feel like a really big risk. But there's things that DWP and others can do to help people manage those risks. But it does take a bit of human-to-human contact.
Yeah.
I mean, we're also trying to develop Job Centre in your pocket, so that, like the NHS app, people can have contact with DWP at their convenience, where people can use an app on their phone. I'm not saying it would be for everybody, but for those people for whom that is most convenient, we want to offer people a much better quality of customer service, which I think also helps build trust. And then that will free up time where we really need to give people more care and attention. And that's about an end to the kind of culture of come in for 10 minutes, tick the box and off you go. We want real help.
But there will also be a certain group of people who will say to themselves, well, what's the point? Because, and I mean, if you look at, I'm particularly thinking of housing costs. So private renters in the lowest income quintile, so the bottom 20% of earners, spend on average 59% of their income on rent. So if you're spending, most of your income that you get from your job just to give it to your landlord, why would you go through all the extra expense of commuting, of, doing all those extra things? I mean, I know there are really good reasons for why everyone should have a job and like it will be a more fulfilling life. But, at the point at which they make that decision, they say, well, if I can get, the housing cost portion of universal credit, I can get, discounts on other things as a benefits claimant. I get a little bit of money. Actually, my financial position in the short term won't be that different if I'm employed or not.
There's two things I would say in response to that. The first thing is you just made a really good case for us building some more homes. So that people
absolutely.
have got
I know
more.
it's not your department.
No, but I mean, I think about it a lot. People need to have the choice and move into a home that they want to buy, or a better choice of rented accommodation too. So that is, you just made an excellent case for that. Second point I'd make is if you look at the types of labour markets that we've got in the UK, and you mentioned it makes no sense to talk about the UK labour market because it's actually lots of different things. At the time of the white paper, we published an analysis of the 14 different types of labour market that we as a department felt we could see in the UK. And some of the worst performing labour markets, they have, the health challenge is really significant there. And also they're often places where deindustrialization scarred the range of jobs that were available. So I think what I really worry about is those places where, there hasn't been enough growth for a long time. And I would say that's as much a problem as housing, and where we need that investment from, for example, the transition to net zero, to bring those new jobs to really revitalise the employment market.
I think it's fair to describe this situation as all part of kind of interconnected problems, right? Of health, of housing, of economic growth.
If there was a simple lever within the social security system or any other bit of government to sort this out, we could have done it.
Yeah.
And also, I don't think anybody should repeat the mistakes of the kind of universal credit argument that was made. We just change this thing and lo and behold, all the problems will be solved. Well, now, as it happened, the situation got worse, not better. I think we can make our social security system work much better, and that will only work if we've got objective of full and fulfilling employment and also an NHS that is performing at the top of its ability.
Ultimately, you have got the very large, knotty problem of trying to fix the benefit system and the labour market without spending more money, right?
Sure, but we spend quite a considerable amount of money already. My argument is I think we can spend that money better. Yeah. And what gives me hope and makes me want to do that even more is every time I go into a job centre, work coaches are just chomping at the bit. We have 17,000 approximately work coaches right across the UK, and they see the failings of the system day in, day out, and they have been enthusiastic, to say the least, about doing things differently. So that makes me feel like we might as well get caught in the act of trying. Yeah.
And are the jobs there, ultimately, are the jobs there for people who, once they are persuaded that, the benefit system can continue to support them while they look for work, is there good work there for them?
There are many good jobs out there, but there are too many towns and places within cities where there hasn't been enough attention paid on getting the good jobs. And I grew up in Merseyside in the 80s and 90s where our population shrank. You sort of got the impression that opportunity was elsewhere, and that's not acceptable to me. It's not acceptable that this generation goes through that feeling that there's nothing down for us here. And if you want to have a good job and opportunity, you have to move. Of course, people will move for their career. That's fine. But you shouldn't feel like you have to, or worse, that the government of the day doesn't give a stuff about where you're from. So my determination is if there are places in this country where there are not enough good jobs and opportunity, that we work right across government and with our colleagues in local and regional government to make that happen.